Alright, hey, it's Laura. Welcome to my last summer young adult book review video. If you have watched any of the other videos over the course of the last couple months, I have been using some of my time over the summer to work my way through the list of Prince Award winners for young adult literature on a quest, a never-ending quest, to find cool, interesting, new books and authors that I can recommend to my students. And it's been a really cool journey. I think it's introduced me to a lot of writers and books that I wouldn't have necessarily read. I think it's also reaffirmed the importance as a teacher of reading widely and being aware of kind of what's cool and trending, especially in the young adult genre, and also the importance of pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. I read a lot of books this summer that are not really my taste, and I didn't necessarily enjoy them all the time, but it really opened my eyes up to the fact that I have a lot of students that some of these books would really appeal to, and I have to be aware of all kinds of different books, all different subjects, all different genres, so that I can make recommendations to all different types of students. So I'm at that point in the summer where we're a couple weeks away from going back to work, and suddenly my brain is consumed with ideas about the upcoming school year. This always happens a couple weeks from the end, where I just start thinking nonstop and kind of mentally planning ideas for the upcoming school year. So this will be my last video, because otherwise it'd be just a lot of stuff to juggle. I'm also in grad school, so kind of gearing up for the semester and starting to do some reading for that. So unless you want me to review Short Introduction to Literary Theory, which I can if you want me to, but otherwise I'm going to be kind of focusing on school and grad school stuff. But I do want to talk about my last young adult book that I read, which was Jasper Jones by Craig Silvey. I've really mastered the which side I hold it up on, so if nothing else, I've just become so well versed at sides on iMovie. So Jasper Jones is by Craig Silvey, an Australian writer. I had never read anything of his before, and I enjoyed it. That wasn't very convincing, was it? It was alright. We're gonna go with that. Maybe like 3 out of 5 stars. There was definitely a point in the middle where I just kind of like flung it back against the side of the couch and was like, I'm done reading this. Like, I don't want to read it anymore. But I kept going, I think primarily because it's a mystery, and so a desire to figure out the mystery kind of pushed me and fueled me towards the end of the book. But I still want to talk to you about it a little bit, because again, it wasn't necessarily a book that I loved, but I think maybe some students would really like it. So I'll do a quick plot summary. I'll talk a little bit about a few things you could use this book to teach. I think it opens up a lot of really interesting discussions about discrimination and prejudice, so I'll talk about that later. And also it's a really good book for teaching vocabulary and context, which again I'll talk about later too. And then I'll briefly discuss what kinds of kiddos would like this book. So brief plot summary, like many of the books I've reviewed, it is a mystery, so I don't want to give very much away. All I will tell you is that the story focuses on a kind of shy, bookish 13-year-old boy named Charlie Buckton who lives in a very small town in Australia. And he writes a lot, he reads a lot, he's kind of, he lives a very safe existence until one night the town outcast, Jasper Jones, shows up at his window and says that he needs Charlie's help. He takes Charlie with him to the woods where he lives for all intents and purposes. Jasper has a pretty rough life. We'll get into that later. But anyway, so he takes him to his secret hideout in the woods, and there is a girl there who is hanging from a tree and she's dead. And so Jasper is really worried that if he reveals this to the authorities or to anyone, that they'll blame it on him and he'll get framed for it, which is not that far-fetched. Pretty much everything that goes wrong in town gets blamed on Jasper Jones. So somehow he decides that in order to figure out what has happened to this girl, he and Charlie need to drown the body, and then they can figure out kind of what happened. So Charlie just gets wrapped up very quickly in this crazy kind of chain of events. So they end up drowning the girl. She is Laura Wishart, who goes to Charlie's school. Interestingly, in a couple ways interesting, she is she was Jasper's girlfriend or kind of secret love interest. She's also the older sister of Eliza Wishart, who is Charlie's kind of crush at school. So that night kind of sets up the whole rest of the book. On a very basic level, it's a mystery. Who killed Laura, and what were the circumstances surrounding her death? In many ways, it's also kind of a love story, interestingly enough, between Charlie and Eliza, kind of a story of first love. Now, obviously, that first love has some major obstacles, namely the fact that everyone is searching for Laura, everyone thinks that she's missing. Of course, Charlie knows that she's not. He knows that he and Jasper drowned her, and that's kind of weighing on him like a brick in his stomach that whole summer. So starting things up with her younger sister, obviously there are going to be some significant obstacles in that relationship. Eliza has some secrets of her own, which are revealed as the book goes on. So it's kind of a story of first love. On a very kind of core level, it's a coming of age story. It's about Charlie kind of discovering who he is and asking himself all these big questions, understandably, after what happened. Why do people do bad things? What causes people to want to harm one another? Why do horrible things exist in the world? So those kinds of big questions that we all kind of are opened up to at some point. Charlie just happens to be abruptly ripped out of his cocoon and forced to confront these questions. In terms of what you can use this book to teach, I do think that it opens up some really interesting questions about prejudice and discrimination. One of the core reasons that everyone blames everything on Jasper is because he is what's initially referred to in the book as a half-caste, and I didn't know what this meant, so I looked it up, and either way it's explained as the book goes on. I just wasn't too familiar with kind of Australian cultural kind of tensions. I just wasn't aware of that. So Jasper is half Aboriginal. His mother was Aboriginal. So I think in many ways it draws interesting parallels to some of the prejudice that exists in our country, and I think it would be really interesting to kind of have students draw those kinds of connections and to read a story that takes place in another country but shares some similar kind of racial tensions. I think it's really interesting. I think there are also thematic parallels to that with Charlie's best friend Jeffrey, who is Vietnamese. This novel takes place during the Vietnam War, and so there are some scenes of prejudice against Jeffrey and his family. So again, adding a whole other layer to that theme of racism and prejudice. I think it would be interesting to have students discuss that. As I mentioned earlier, this is a really good book for teaching vocabulary in context. Obviously, it's really important to teach vocabulary contextually. This is a great book for that because the diction is really elevated. I think that's one of the reasons that I kind of found it to be inauthentic and kind of stilted at times. Even though Charlie does read widely and write a fair amount, I just didn't feel like a 13-year-old would talk that way. So in terms of the narrative voice, I found it to be a little stilted, but the vocabulary is excellent, so it'd be a really good book for teaching students to kind of use context clues to define some of these more difficult words. In terms of what students this book would appeal to, I'm really kind of torn on this. I think that the level of the writing would be appropriate for more advanced readers, but I think that a lot of students would get into the story, the mystery of it, kind of the coming of age element. It is kind of an adventure story at times with Jasper and Charlie trying to figure out what happened to Laura. So I think it's important to be aware that the reading level is a little higher. I think it would be a struggle maybe for average or below average readers. I think that they could handle it. But I do think maybe more boys would enjoy this type of story. So keep that in mind if you want to make a book recommendation to your kids. I think a lot of students would really like this book. So that's Jasper Jones, my last book review of the summer. So I hope you've enjoyed the videos. If you didn't watch them earlier in the summer, you can scroll down, they're all down there. And it's been really cool to get a chance to review these books. And I'll still be writing on my Tumblr about teaching stuff as the school year begins. There's going to be all kinds of stuff happening at my school this year, so I'll have plenty to talk about. So I'll still be around, but I'm really excited to write more about what's going on at school this year and with grad school. So thanks for tuning in, and hopefully everyone has a good rest of the summer and a really good start to the school year. So, alright, see ya!